This week on the Eldritch Lorecast.
Is this Fortnite?
James and I have diverted. One of us has become the Draw Steel correspondent, and one of us has become the Daggerheart correspondent.
Can I ask a Draw Steel question?
Yes.
No.
And
In my experience with Draw Steel,
how does resting resource management work in Daggerheart?
I can't be the only one who remembers this.
Yes, you can.
Daggerheart.
Look at that. They've got the book right there.
all that and more right now.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast. We are back to full power.
Alive!
I am joined, as always, I'm Ben Byrne, by the way, joined, as always, unfailingly, by Dael Kingsmill, Shawn Merwin, James Hake, and James.
I can't believe our necromantic ritual worked.
I know. Can you... you might say we artificer reanimated them.
Oh!
Whoa!
One
You went
might
there, you went
say
there.
that.
Wah, 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 wah. Anyway, Mick Chaos on YouTube had a question, because you can comment down below and ask questions if you haven't clicked away from this video by this point. And he's asking, creating game atmosphere. We talked about this a little bit last week, Dael and I. He's asking specifically about in a crowded game store.
Love this question. And I often avoid playing in game stores because I have found it impossible to create atmosphere within a public space, right? To me, atmosphere is a combination of three factors. It's a combination of the player attitudes at the table, right? They influence each other in kind of a cyclical way, but it's also lighting and it's also sound, right? Players, lighting, and sound are the three primary ways of creating atmosphere. You can use like handouts and props and stuff, but that feels like it's a separate conversation. And in a game store, you have no control over the lighting and the sound. You are at the mercy of not just the store owners, but the other customers and players there. And so I've long maintained that it is impossible and you should not try. And I recently went to a new game store, brand new game store I'd never been to before, in West Seattle, called Meeple's Games, for a Daggerheart launch event back on May 20th. And I played a quick start adventure of Daggerheart. One of the store's employees was running the adventure. It was awesome. My friend and friend of the Lorecast, Brooks Donahue, was there. And it was an awesome table. Every player was on. Most of the players were also DMs or GMs. And so we had a really great rapport of like everyone was trying to do what was best for the table and not hog spotlight. And it was an awesome game, but there was no atmosphere.
Sure.
And so that's my answer to the question is I don't think it's possible. And I think you should stop trying and focus on other ways of making your game awesome.
Are you familiar with the group Cheap Trick? The rock band.
Yeah, all right.
The Flame, their founder, took the rest of the band to see a band called Slade, which was a glam rock band back in the 70s, even before my time. And the reason he took them to see this band is because they used every cheap trick in the book to draw the fans in, right? To get them doing what they wanted to keep the energy up. As the DM, you can use every cheap trick in the book to draw the player's attention to you. Because you can't do atmosphere until you are present, until you have the presence to lead it. So there are many cheap tricks you could use to establish that presence. And the first one is standing up. Even if you are in a crowded, not just game store, but convention with hundreds of other tables playing, if you stand up, even if you're short like I am, you'll be taller than the other people at the table. Project your voice without disturbing the other tables. And that's the hard part at a crowded place, because you can really draw attention to yourself, but you don't want to draw the attention of the 50 other players around you at different tables. What I did at the last GaryCon, which is terribly, terribly noisy and crowded, is a personal microphone that has a little speaker right here. And once I learned to use it without horrible feedback or annoying people 100 yards away, it was incredibly effective to save my voice, but also differentiate my voice from all the other voices around you. And then you have hand gestures. You have the things that you learn as an actor, I assume, because I am not one. Physical props, handouts, little pictures of what the NPCs look like, map on the table that shows the play area, a freaking hat. You can use a hat in 100 different ways, right? Turn it sideways and you are one NPC. Turn it around and you are a different NPC. Hold the hat in your hand and crinkle it, and now you are a third NPC, right? All of these things are just tiny tools that you have. But when you use them well, you create not just that presence, but the atmosphere that you're searching for as well.
I kind of agree with James a little bit that, like, what I remember, because I started playing in a game store, and I played in a game store for probably 2 years before we got comfortable enough with the strangers who became our best friends to take them home to meet our mums. And the thing I do remember is, like, you know, we used to have a really loud table of folks who were playing like party games, basically, the same night we were playing D&D. So the first half of the session was always really loud, and you can't fight that, especially in a convention hall, if it is because then you're surrounded by hundreds of people. Fighting the noise is impossible. And so kind of taking a little bit of Dael's advice, which I think I've forgotten, but am reminded of in this conversation, talking about game stores and public spaces specifically, it's just like, chill out. You know, we had very thematic moments occur at our tables, very memorable scenes I remember from playing in game stores, but we weren't trying to force those scenes to happen. It was just that everybody was engaged with the game. I think that was maybe a little thing we forgot last week, Dael, was what James just said about, the players need to bring the atmosphere themselves. There needs to be that kind of like buy-in. And if you have that, then the rest shall kind of
if you build it, they will come.
A little bit.
You know, there's a degree to which your players are never going to remember the whole of the session or the campaign or the encounter. And I don't just mean they're not going to remember it in great detail. I mean, they're not going to remember most of it. They're not going to remember what they rolled on turn 3. They're going to remember those moments that stand out. And that's the thing I try to build into any encounter that I want to be memorable. I'm like, what is the moment that they're going to remember when they're talking about it in the car park afterwards? That's the thing that I'm going to focus on. And I think that's actually a lot of the key to atmosphere is just those little set piece moments where you go, boom, that's what the atmosphere was. And you remember that atmosphere afterwards. I think it doesn't always matter as much in the moment whether that atmosphere is hitting. It matters whether it hits in the memory bank afterwards is kind of the thing. I also wanted to shout out, I mean, it's not necessarily a helpful piece of advice for this person because it seems like they've got an established, game that they run at a friendly local game store. But if you are looking to start games at a friendly local game store, some places like I know Geeky Teas in LA have separate rooms that you can book for your TTRPG game. And those are even themed rooms. Like they have sci-fi rooms for your sort of Star Trek games, and they have their Hobbit rooms for their more sort of classic fantasy games, and they're setting up more and more rooms all the time. So there might be, and even if it's not, a fancy themed room, you can still sort of look for a place that might have that sort of separated area for you to play your TTRPG in, and that might be worthwhile if you're looking to start a game at a game store.
Let me even say this. There are some public libraries around that have rental conference rooms, and that's
playing
usually
a TTRPG in a library. This is genuinely, like, I have run games in libraries probably like 30% of the time I've run games. Like, it's a good option.
One of the first times I playtested Draw Steel in its current incarnation, I was on the road. There was no way I was going to get back to my home. And so I went to a library. And then the power went out and it was a whole ordeal. But I just got a solo room and I called in from my laptop, and it was great.
This might be an odd question that may or may not yield interesting results. What is the most awkward or strange or not fit for purpose public space that you have played D&D before?
We played on the front porch of our friend's house in the middle of the city, Buffalo, with people walking by, and it was like a condo type thing. So there are other people coming up onto the porch and passing through. And one person said, "What are you doing?" And we just froze like we were 12-year-olds embarrassed to say. And everyone's looking at each other, like, we're playing Dungeons and Dragons. And they're like, cool. And they just kept right on going. But we got a lot of interesting looks in this front porch.
I had a similar experience where our game store that we usually played at was not open because it was a New Year's Day, but it was the day we played D&D, so we still wanted to play. So we went and played in a restaurant. And we thought, well, it's a place where there are tables and people have food. It's not that dissimilar from a game store. It's fine. Yeah, the looks of people kind of walking past. And then at one point we had some woman just kind of stop, stare at us and go, "Is this Fortnite?" We're like, no, it is not Fortnite.
Yes, it is.
See, and that's where we differ, Ben Byrne. Because I would have been, yes, this is Fortnite.
This is exactly what your nephews
Would you like to play Fortnite with us?
Yeah, can't you see us all dancing? We're all dancing. Let us jump into the tiny bit of news we have this week because by popular demand, Daggerheart has released officially. Woo! And the Australians can start talking about it openly. Yay.
There was a Critical Role 10th anniversary party that I got an invitation to, and I sort of foolishly left before the big launch party. I wanted to be up here in Seattle for the big launch day event because there are Geeky Teas in LA, like you just mentioned, Dael, had an enormous Daggerheart launch day event. Spencer Stark was there, Members was there, all the Darrington Press bigwigs were there. There was public play, there were panels. It was like a miniature Daggerheart convention. I wanted to hold down the fort in my hometown a little bit because there was no way any of that love was going to make it outside of LA. It's just too concentrated. Everyone was buzzing about Daggerheart even at the pre-event. But then, like I just said in our previous question, me and Brooks, we went over to West Seattle and we played a game with a bunch of people who had never played it before, and I had an awesome time. I had played Daggerheart a number of times before using the playtest rules, the latest playtest, and the game has changed in many small, significant ways since then, but not so differently that it feels like you're playing a totally different game, right? It's not as significant a difference as, say, the Draw Steel we played at PAX Oz in 2022 versus the Draw Steel now. That game has metamorphosed, but Daggerheart feels like it's found itself, more like. I think everyone came to it really well. Like I said, it was a table full of GMs. And I think that might be, in some ways, the ideal audience for this group because there's a natural desire that the game has to let people be expressive without putting too many limitations on it. And so that sort of style of play, which you'll see in Powered by the Apocalypse games and games like Fate, I think, though I've only played it that one time with all of you, that works best when the rules aren't trying to corral problem players. There are certainly rules to the game. There's certainly mechanics that will guide you in a certain direction. But ultimately, it was a ton of fun.
James and I have diverted in that one of us has become the Draw Steel correspondent, and one of us has become the Daggerheart correspondent, and we know our roles. No, I'm really looking forward to getting to have a go at it. Like, I want to ask James, like, can you give me just like the I don't know, the most dreamy-eyed rendition of like, what were your favorite like moments of the game, even if it's just like a cool thing that happened in the game?
My favorite moment of that game, it's clear in my mind. There's a mechanic in the game called the tag team attack, where you and a friend can spend a large amount of the universal fluid resource hope and basically do a combo attack where you both act simultaneously. And you are encouraged to kind of take one of your powers, the card powers that you have, and describe how those two kind of meld together into this big dual turn action. And I don't think, I need to look deeper into the rules to make sure about this, but I don't think there's any like special effect that it happens other than you take two simultaneous turns. But the way it just reaches out a hand to be like, okay, what is this Final Fantasy-ass move that you have just thrown together look like? It was such a huge moment for both players at the table because we've been fighting a bunch of minions up until that point, these sort of skeletons that had Jason the Argonaut style risen up out of the ground. And it was like all of us were flush with hope. We were like, we can't gain any more hope. So we want to use cool abilities, but we've got nothing but basic attacks. And then this wraith shows up out of the mist, and me and the person who was playing the party leader like locked eyes for a moment, and we're like, "Oh yeah, it's going down right now." It was sick as hell.
That's awesome. It just fills my heart with hope. Hey.
The thing that the game feels like the most is a version of D&D that is really encouraging you to roleplay rather than being ambivalent about whether or not you roleplay. And so it's got all of these mechanics that kind of hook into how are you describing the scene? How does your character's backstory roll into this? How do your experiences, which are like your custom design skills, flow into this? And it's a lot of little things that I think are not overwhelming for people who are coming from D&D for the very first time. But once they reach a critical mass of little things, it's a sort of transformative experience.
I'm going to have to eat this elephant one bite at a time, because the first playtest I did, it was all about the math. Right? I was playing and I was, wait, what's the percentage chance of rolling with hope? And I'm like doing math on little. And I'm not great at math, but I know enough to do probability. So I'm doing all of this. We're going to be playing again in a couple of weeks. And hopefully at that point, I will stop worrying about the math and start worrying about how the story flows and see if it scratches the itch of bringing a very robust mechanical game to a very role play heavy group.
Yeah.
And see how it all works together.
That's a salient point you bring up, Shawn. Roman and I had a video call a little while ago. Roman is one of our Lorecast frequent listeners, where we talked about the Daggerheart mechanics, because he's been running it a lot as well. And the thing that we agreed on was, I think the crits happen maybe a little too often. Crits are whenever you roll doubles on the two D12s. And it's something like a 7% chance of critical success on any given roll. And there's no crit fail option, right? So not only is it higher than a nat 20, but there's no nat 1 equivalent. And once upon a time, I played a cyberpunk game called Eclipse Phase. It was a D100 system, and it had crits on doubles also, right? So on 11, 22, 33, stuff like that. But whether it was a crit success or a crit fail depended on whether or not the roll would clear the DC. So if you rolled a critical on a failed roll, it's a critical fail. If you rolled and you get it. I think it would probably make for a grittier Daggerheart game, right? There's a world in which Daggerheart's crit system is actually perfect, and I just haven't played enough. It's designed to roll around like big successes frequently and no big failures. But I think having a system similar to that Eclipse Phase, whether or not it passes a DC, would work out really well.
Have you gotten eyes at all, James, as the Daggerheart correspondent, on, because you just mentioned like maybe it would make it grittier, maybe it would make it, not to overuse the term I overuse, but more dark fantasy or whatever. Have you gotten eyes on the frames that they've talked about in terms and what rules they introduce to change the system into different genres, or are they more thematic touches?
Yeah. I love the campaign frames. It's a really interesting way, because it's a way of doing hardcover adventures. I don't think Daggerheart, just offhand, is going to publish hardcover adventures in the way that D&D does. I think they're going to do campaign frames like this as more small scale expansions, because the campaign frames, like I'm looking at this one right now. I opened to Beast Feast, which is their sort of Delicious in Dungeon analog. It's all about cooking up creatures. And so each one of these campaign frames, they've got a sort of breakdown of how do the core ancestries and communities fit into this sort of light campaign setting that the campaign frame implies. What sort of player principles should you have in mind? What sort of GM principles should you have in mind? Even things like what sort of starting equipment do you have here? Because the core Daggerheart starting equipment is very, it's very heroic fantasy. It's very, here's your greatsword, here's your battle axe, here's your roguish daggers. But here, this campaign frame has the idea of you are all starving peasants who, in sort of a famine situation have no choice but to go into a dungeon and start harvesting monster parts. And so your starting equipment is cleaver, sharpened rake, iron skillet, cooking knife, rolling pin, all this stuff, enchanted mop. And then it has all of these different flavor profiles for the monsters: sweet, salty, bitter, savory. It's not just a system of, okay, here's a story that the GM can follow and prescribe, but it's also a sort of mechanical package. And I think you'll get really clear eyes on that when Critical Role releases, Age of Umbra. Because Age of Umbra is a campaign frame in this book. And so you would be able to kind of cross-reference, okay, how is Matt, who wrote the campaign frame originally, translating the writing in the book into what you see on the screen? I think that'll be a real clarifying moment for just about everyone, myself included.
Well, speaking of new things coming to Daggerheart already. They have, with the launch of the game, launched also The Void, which is their playtesting website, among, I think, other things as well. I don't think it's quite accurate to say that it's the unearthed arcana of Daggerheart entirely. And released on The Void, they have released 2 new classes in playtest for Daggerheart already. The first is the Warlock, and it's what you think. And the second is the Fighter, and it's not what you think. Warlock, they've released 2 subclasses for it called the Pact of the Endless and the Pact of the Wrathful, which sound, and I haven't looked deeply at them, I'll admit. I didn't think it was really worth looking at it if I don't understand the rules of the game, but maybe, James, you have. But that sounds a lot broader and a lot less specific and a lot more like you choose what your patron is within this theme, as opposed to like literally what your patron is, which the D&D Warlocks seem to do a lot more. Is that accurate and fair, or have you not been able to look at these yet, James?
Yeah, I've looked at them. I would say that one of the core design principles for Daggerheart is to take familiar high fantasy tropes, many of which have enormous overlap with D&D because D&D codified them in the first place. Mm-hmm. One, distill them down, right? Take what would be an entire paragraph in a D&D book and distill it into a sentence or 2. And then, if expansion is needed, expand it in a way that draws first from the character principles and the world principles rather than from, a mechanical standpoint. And mechanics will arise out of that. As you can see, like the Fighter, which has what D&D players might be clocking as monk traits more than big sword fighter traits. It has all of these martial forms that are really more intended to show, what is your fighting style? When you go at a fight, are you a sort of fluid and judo style, Bruce Lee style hand-to-hand fighter, or are you a big hulking pugilist that's going to bash people in the face, knock them to the ground? And in a game of D&D or a game of Draw Steel, we would be thinking about, okay, well, what are all of the sort of mechanical interlinking parts that will express that fantasy? And in a Daggerheart game, you'd be thinking more of what are the ways in which I can describe a narrative event that flows from these traits?
I think I'm really going to need to play this game to get an idea of like how mechanically it works. I get a lot of flack online for like only really being familiar with 5e and so equating everything kind of to 5e, but I designed for 5e, so I don't really have time to play a lot of other stuff. But anyway, so in my head, on the scale of like just completely open storytelling games where there's not a dice roll involved, it's just kind of, impro sports or suggestions, all the way to, I don't know, Pathfinder 2e or something, like super crunchy, super mechanically, like there's a rule for everything, a rule for lifting your finger. It feels like, 5e sits somewhere towards the middle of that, where the rules are there and they're solid and they matter, but there's a lot of openness for improvisation and a lot of hand waviness of like, I don't know, the DM will come up with something. It feels like Draw Steel sits towards the crunchier end, like on the left shoulder, and Daggerheart is directly on the right shoulder, where, as you've said yourself, James, it's not an uncrunchy system.
Yeah.
But just the way you keep describing it feels kind of a little bit like Fate to me, where I found it a little bit difficult to wrap my head around Fate because I kept trying to run it like it was 5e and then going like, oh, wait, no, right, this room has a concept, and a concept is an idea of a theme, and a theme, and it's like, what are all these floaty terms? How do I ground them into like what's the reality of this world that we're constructing,
I would say that if D&D in its current incarnation, right, the 5.24 or whatever you want to call it, 5.5,
sure.
5th edition 2024. If we're going to commit the pseudo fallacy of saying that mechanics and story are a binary. It's an easy way of looking at it. Then D&D is 50-50 right now. It's got 50% sort of flowy storytelling, 50% war game. I think Draw Steel moves like 75-25 into the war game territory, and Daggerheart moves 75-25 into the story game territory.
Okay, interesting.
Also,
interesting.
Ben, if it helps at all, people say that I only really know 5e, and they're wrong. So I don't think that you knowing more games would actually help online. I think that's just what people say when they disagree with you.
I do know more games, but...
I just think that they don't have a really good argument, so they just say, play other games. And it's like, I did. That's...
Thanks for the suggestion.
That's what this video was about. I don't know. I made a video about other games and people said play more games. I don't know what to tell you.
Well, speaking of 5e, we are running a second giveaway. We ran one last week. We're running a second one this week. This one for the Grim Hollow Players Pack, which is on D&D Beyond. So last week we gave away some codes for Layers of Etheros on D&D Beyond. This week we're giving away the Grim Hollow Players Pack, which includes 2 new species, the Wexelkin and the Disembodied, 6 new subclasses across various classes, which we'll go through in a second. We've got spells in there, my favorite one being Flents, where you literally Ramsay Bolton someone to death by slicing off pieces of their skin, not by chopping off their wiener. We've got Phoenix Flames, where you make yourself explode. That one's always a fun one at parties. We've got magic items like the Bow of 4, where you can... I love the Bow of 4 because it feels incredibly rangery, but it also feels incredibly powerful. It's basically... I choose earth, and then you shoot earth, and then I choose water, and you shoot water. It's not quite like that, but it's kind of like you shoot elements from your bow, and you choose which element you want to shoot. If you want a chance to enter, the link will be down in the comments if you're watching this on YouTube or anywhere else. Spotify, it'll be in the show notes. And I want to take a quicker look at these subclasses, 2 of them in particular, the Barbarian Path of the Carrion Raven and the Fighter Bladebreaker, which actually come from Grim Hollow Valican clans and incorporate, James, I believe this was some of your at least initial design work, if not the actual classes themselves, in terms of martial maneuvers.
Yeah, a lot of hands touch those martial maneuvers, from Sam Manel to Tamor Raymond to some folks who you know better than I do, Shawn, and so their names are eluding me, but a lot of really, really skilled mechanical designers worked on that under my supervision at best.
It's hard to not love the Rogue's Misfortune Bringer, the bad luck that, and then of course the lot of damage that they rain down upon their enemies is fun.
I had an Inquisition Domain cleric, I believe, in one of my campaigns who played. His pitch was, I want to play like a youth worker who's kind of like trying to reach the spellcasters in the party and just trying to be like really kind to them, but trying to show them the path of light to turn away from their blasphemous magic
fellow
ways.
Kids? Yeah.
Yeah, a little bit. He ended up dying a horrible death, but it was a fun character. Worth noting, these are the 2014 versions of these subclasses in this pack. So if you're playing 2014 at the moment, you can check those out. Enter the giveaway. If you want to GM Ghostfire Games, we are running games at Gen Con, and we need talented GMs like yourself. There is a link where you can go sign up with Boldman Games, who are helping us run our games at Gen Con. I'm saying games a lot, but there's lots of games. There's Grim Hollow games. There's Ethereal Expanse games. Shawn will be there running games.
One thing about Ghostfire Gaming, there's games.
It's true.
There is.
And if you've never run a game at Gen Con before, it is an incredible experience. Talking about running games in public, lots of good stuff. If you sign up with Baldman Games, you can get paid to run these games. Get paid in a variety of ways, including free badges or free rooms, or just get paid for the number of gamers who you run games for. And if you're not into Grim Hollow, I don't know why you wouldn't be, or not into the Ethereal Expanse, you're absolutely mad if you're not. You can also run other types of games, including Learn to Play. So like running very, very short demos for brand new people, such a heartwarming experience to see all of these fresh faces who has heard about Dungeons and Dragons, but isn't quite sure how to play. And they just eat this stuff up. And it is so, it will restore your faith in gamers. If you are feeling down about some discourse going on here or there, take 2 hours and run 4 slots of Learn to Play, and it will restore your faith in humanity and in gamers. Not that gamers aren't human, but sometimes.
Well, depends. I think that's also a really good call for if you want to get into convention GMing, but you're not sure, you're a little bit timid, you're like, am I good enough as a GM? I know that people have that sort of imposter syndrome. Why not dip your toe in with running some beginner games? Because the players are newer to the game or new completely, so they're not going to give you as much of a hard time if you don't know the rules. Not that I've ever been given a hard time at a convention, for the record. And secondly, it's shorter, as Shawn just said. So you're not running for sort of 3 to 4 hour slots. You're kind of running, is it like an hour or an hour and a half, Shawn?
I think the Learn to Play is 20 minutes to a half an hour. Then there is a 2 hour. Wow. Then there is a 2 hour intro adventure.
Gotcha.
It's more like 90 minutes, but in a 2-hour slot. And the cool thing is you are surrounded by people who are very experienced game masters who have done this for 30, 40, 50 years, who are more than happy to help you out, show you the ropes, share some tips, share some of their goodies. And it's just a great experience to be with your people for an extended bit of time.
I mean, even last year was the first Gen Con where I was running games and got to hang out with more of the GMs and the Boldman crew and folks who get involved in that way. And very welcoming crowd, very easy to kind of just, step into and be hanging out with folks.
And you know what the internet would tell those super experienced GMs?
Play more
different
games.
systems.
Play more games.
Never hurts, but you don't have to.
Well, speaking of other systems, we're going to dive into some listener emails. There wasn't really much more news this week except for yada yada, tariffs causing more chaos. Yeah,
Wait,
it was
tariff time. There's still tariffs. We're done.
There are, yeah. They're still causing chaos. It would have been kind of repeat of the same news, but different companies struggling in different ways. Anyway, Orion emailed podcast@ghostfiregaming.com with a question that was kind of themed around Draw Steel, but I reckon we could kind of talk about this in relation to other systems like Daggerheart, Shadow Dark, or any other system people want to talk about, which was how to build encounter progression and story flow in a game like Draw Steel, where resource management is very different to 5e. Much of the online TTRPG DM advice assumes that folks are using the 5e rest system, where characters lose resources progressively until they rest. Whereas Draw Steel, from this email and from my memory of it, Dael, correct me if I'm wrong, you kind of gain resources the longer you go, building towards kind of climactic moments.
Yeah, so you're losing some resources and you're gaining some resources, and some resources only exist during the encounter itself, right? So you are, every time you complete an encounter, you're gaining victories. Which build up over time. And victories are great because when you start the next encounter, you automatically generate a bunch of your personal class resource. So, you get your barbarian resource, you get your rogue resource, you get your elementalist resource. I said barbarian and rogue, and those are not Draw Steel classes. They're going to come for me. You get what I'm saying.
You need to play other games.
I should play more games. But you get sort of a bunch of your personal class resource based on your number of victories as you begin an encounter. It is worth mentioning that the director who's running the game, the bad guys are also generating their resource based on how many victories you have. So they're also starting the next encounter stronger than they would have been previously. It's sort of balanced around this idea of you want to keep going because you're stronger than you've been the whole time, but at the same time, the bad guys are going to be stronger than they've been the whole time. So it's a little bit of a back and forth. And Orion does mention that the only resource that you're really losing is stamina, which I think is an interesting kind of point of, I don't know whether everyone would agree with this, but my experience of playing the game, particularly over, we did like 3 or 4 days of playing most of the day. So, we got kind of an extended play experience there. And what my experience was, so stamina is kind of the equivalent of hit points, but you have recoveries, which you can use during combat to regain health and those things. And for me, the experience became that I wasn't worried so much about losing stamina. I was worried about losing recoveries. So anytime I was about to go into a new combat, I wasn't looking at my stamina and going, oh, I'm only at half stamina. I was looking at my recoveries and going, I have 1 recovery left. I have 1 left, and I don't know if I'm going to make it through the rest of this. And then, but there are different mechanics in there with like the conduit, and there are sort of little things where different classes can use their recoveries on you, and so then it becomes, okay, I only have 1, but they've got 6, so maybe we're going to be okay. And it becomes a real interesting sort of back and forth of do we rest, do we not rest? And then of course there's the tug as well of the more victories you have. If you go and you take your respite, your long rest, you convert that into experience, you might level up, those sorts of things. So it is definitely a different sort of a balancing act compared to 5e.
What I love about the Draw Steel system that Dael just described is it sort of tries to solve the problem for you. Rather than having to worry about just this resource drain, you're winning either way. if you stop and take a rest, you are losing that momentum that you got by the victories you were gaining, but you get everything back. If you don't rest, you have these victories, you're more powerful than you would have been. Your recoveries are lower and your stamina might be lower, but you can probably get by. So there's less that the game master or the adventure creator has to worry about in terms of, is this too much? Because the players can decide when it is too much more than they would have to in other games.
Can I ask a draw steal question?
Yes.
No.
And this is kind of... Because what this
One of us
question about
only tells the truth
resting...
and one of us only lies.
I was about to say, well, I know who the liar is, but then I realized that would be implicating someone. Because this question about rests and the way that you structure the game also had me thinking about like video games and things, right? Because I had been playing Oblivion, the remaster, recently, and it struck me that I had no reason to need to rest unless it was to level up. But otherwise, there was no ebb and flow of going to sleep, unlike a more modern but similar-ish RPG, Kingdom Come Deliverance, where like you have a tired mechanic where you get tired and you need to go and rest, which creates a natural day in, day out kind of cycle of that feels kind of simmy in a way. And I don't think 5e's rest system is particularly simmy, but it can have that campaign structure of,
it does force you to rest. Like you are out of spells. You know what I mean? Like, yeah.
Absolutely. But you could also structure the way that you run sessions around it, right? Where you could say, and I don't necessarily run my games this way. I certainly structure the way
I play Baldur's Gate 3 around it. You know what I mean? Like,
well, to say that like a one shot is, okay, this is an adventuring day. We will long rest at the end of it. But this is going to be like a whole day of adventuring here. Whereas Draw Steel, because it is quite combat focused, when we ran a playtest at one point, we were doing like the Goblins Watchtower or something. And it was like, all right, we're out the front and we're fighting these goblins. And then we get in and there's like 3 levels of this thing. And Roman, who was running the game for us, had to jump us kind of to the top level to complete the playtest because there were all these encounters all the way through. Keep in mind, it was a playtest at the time. And so we were kind of like, and we were all learning the rules for the first time as well. It was early playtest,
we were at a convention, yeah, all those things.
But I was like, how were we possibly going to get through this in a single session if it's just combat encounter, like every level of this tower until you get to the top? How is there time to get through all of this? Like, what is a typical Draw Steel session like if it's just encouraging you to continuously throw yourself into the next fight, so to speak? Or is that what it's like?
I wouldn't say that's how it feels in its current form. I also think it's worth noting that an encounter doesn't have to be combat. Like, it could be a negotiation, which is, by the way, oh wow, when we were playing, we went through
speaking of different,
we went through a whole negotiation and then finished and then got the victories for it. I was like, wait, was that a negotiation? I didn't even notice. Like, it was so slick. It just slid right in there. We went right through it. I didn't even notice it was happening. Very smooth. So that was a little different. But, you can negotiate your way through, you can bypass, you can, any number of things can happen. So even if there is a potential combat, you can bypass it, and so that speeds things up. Like, it's got any of the freedom that a D&D game would have in that regard. But also, there is, I think the really fun thing with victories and with sort of recoveries and all those things that I experienced was that moment of tension when some people want to keep going and some people don't. I think that was it was fun because it kind of fell into role play without it intending to in a big, I don't want to like spoil the campaign, but when we were playing, there was a moment where I in particular was like, we can keep going. We could keep going. We should keep going right now. Like, I was like ready and rearing to keep going through. And then others were like, no, we're going to go back. We're going to rest. And then I petulantly, during the respite, decided that I would infiltrate the goblin camp. And it went really well. And you can see it when the videos come out, how well it went. But, like it has that there is something about that balance between victories, I want to keep going, and respite, I want to trade these in and get all my stuff back and get some experience, that I think lends itself to feeling like role play. And so then that kind of I think that the sense of, oh, we've reached a narrative stopping point for the session falls into that sort of role play area more than it does the sort of combat loop, if that makes sense. Sure. Whereas if I play Baldur's Gate 3, for example, I'm always thinking to myself, well, I'll stop playing at my next long rest. You know what I mean? Like that is how I think about it. But I don't think that it works. I think that the mechanics of draw steal, James and I were talking in chat just before about how the binary is not real between story and mechanics. And I think that is one area where, in my experience thus far, I think draw steal's mechanics do lend themselves to story quite neatly.
In my experience with draw steal, my experience is in agreement with Dael's in most ways. Push your luck mechanic that victories and respites propose is really in service to this thing that Colville talks about in a lot of his videos, where even deciding what to do is still part of playing the game, right? That's the thing that he hits a lot in quite a few of his videos, is those times when the players are talking for an hour about whether or not they infiltrate the camp of the Drow. There's a whole video. It's probably, I think it's from when he was talking about Night Below. It sticks in my mind. But one of the players wants to go infiltrate the Drow. The others are like, no way. We're going to get slaughtered. The players go on about it for a while, and no forward progress is made, but they are role-playing and they are decision-making. And so it's bad actual play. Those episodes of Critical Role where they talk about what they're going to do for an hour and then they don't even do that are my least favorite episodes of Critical Role. But they are some of my favorite moments in actually playing a game. I think that's something wise of Draw Steal, is to understand what makes a game really fun to play, maybe as opposed to what makes a game really fun to watch.
How does resting resource management work in Daggerheart and creating that kind of gameplay loop on a macro level?
Daggerheart also has player resources and GM resources. And so all the players have a resource called Hope, and the GM has a resource called Fear. And if you've not played Daggerheart since the playtest, then one of the biggest changes between that and the main game is the way that Fear works. Because essentially, and if you've played its initiative-less combat system, which is, I think, maybe actually my favorite part of the game, rather than a turn order being established, the player characters essentially take action after action after action until their role either prompts the GM to act, or the GM chooses to interrupt the player-driven momentum. Hey, talking about momentum, by spending fear to spotlight an enemy. So again, there are two ways to spotlight an adversary in Daggerheart. Either the dice tell you to, or the GM spends fear in order to do it. It's either at the beginning of a session or after a long rest. I don't remember which. The GM gains an amount of starting fear based on the number of players that are at the table. Likewise, the players can choose to, the players regain hope when they finish a long rest, or whenever they roll with hope in play. Roll with hope, you gain hope. Roll with fear, you give the GM fear. And so there's this push and pull of the players are spending hope to do highly impactful actions, as the GM is spending fear to do actions at all. And this sort of interplay between taking your turn has the chance to generate you a resource versus it has a chance to generate the other side a resource creates this very sort of pendulum swing of drama that goes on throughout not just combat, though I think it's heightened in combat because a lot of roles are happening one after another in combat, but also throughout the course of regular play. One thing that I want to do when I run my next Daggerheart campaign is have the GM's fear be out in the open. And actually, if you look at some of the production stills for Age of Umbra right now, Matt's GM screen has a little fear abacus at the top of it. So he will, I imagine, dramatically slide these red beads to one side as the fear is gained. And it creates this visual indicator of how bad things are getting for the players, right? In a movie, you've got lighting and music and cinematography that will subconsciously influence you to think, even though everything is going great, something horrible is about to happen because these non-diegetic elements are telling you this. And even though your characters might be thinking everything is rosy, you as players seeing that the GM's fear is capped out at 12 right now is telling you, if the GM really wants to, they could just be spending fear after fear after fear after fear. There's an ambush, and these goblins are going to tear through us. So we need to be at the top of our game. We need to be very cautious. Otherwise, things could go very, very, very badly, kind of out of nowhere. And so it's got this cool sort of tension pendulum.
And that also brings us back to the question that I forgot we were answering this whole time. Talking about how to ramp up towards boss battles, keep people going. Well, I think the fear thing, I completely agree. And again, in Draw Steel, there's malice, which the bad guys are building up. Well, they don't keep it between encounters, but you start a new encounter with it. And there's a note in the monster book there that says you might consider putting malice like out in front of everyone so that they can see how much malice you have, because it'll freak them out. And I do love that sort of a thing. I've always talked about how in D20 fantasy, when I'm doing a boss battle, pull out this one specific die and I tell the story every time and say, this was the first roll I ever rolled with this die as a D20. It is blessed to roll well and I'm going to use it to kill you. You know, like I'm a big believer in the sort of big talk for big bad guys. And I think that those things lend into it. In Draw Steel specifically, whoa, I just bashed my table. In Draw Steel specifically, I think that I would consider, and take this with a huge grain of salt, because I've never run the game. I've only played the game. But if I was running the game, and I really wanted to make it feel like things were getting tougher the further you went, I would consider just like using fewer minions and more like platoons the further you go. So in Draw Steel, minions die fairly quick. They're designed to die quite easily. So there's a lot of them and they can do stuff to you, but then you tear through them really quickly. It makes you feel really cool, really powerful. So the fewer minions you get, the further through, the more it starts feeling like, okay, this is like a real thing. If you walk into a room and there's 8 baddies and you think, yes, a squad of minions, but then they're actually bad guys, that starts to feel very real. If you wanted to play with stuff like that, I don't know, just an idea.
It feels like Draw Steel and Daggerheart both kind of play in this area, correct me if I'm wrong, where the tension is mounting because the players are gaining more resources and getting to it through hope or through whatever their specific class thing is in Draw Steel, to be able to unlock those sick kind of like it's almost in Draw Steel it felt, and this was in the playtest, but it felt very much like building meter in Overwatch to unlock your ultimate and kind of unleash that. And so the game is naturally trying to get you to build that towards the kind of final boss or the most difficult combatant in an encounter, to be able to finish them off in a spectacular way. Whereas 5e is almost the inverse, where you're getting weaker, and the general advice for GMs is throw a couple of encounters in front of your like low level easy encounters in front of your party to drain their resources, so they can't just supernova the big bad guy, or encourage them to save their resources so that when they get to the big bad guy, it feels like they've kind of had a few more difficult encounters along the way. It feels like between particularly Draw Steel and 5e, it feels like they're trying to achieve the same thing, but almost like in inverse ways.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And one is the system building the characters up, and the other system is trying to teach the characters like how to save money.
Well, another thing, and Shawn probably knows more about this in terms of game design stuff, but the other thing is that 5e is built around a very different sort of initiative system. So the balance of a combat really swings based on how front-loaded early initiative is. If you have all the bad guys go first, it's going to be really bad for the good guys. If you have all the good guys go first, it's going to be really bad for the bad guys. You can focus fire, you can take out, a bunch of threats early on, like all that sort of stuff. Whereas in Draw Steel, again, it's you roll, and even if you win initiative, you pick who goes first. Then the bad guys have a guy go. Then the good guys have a go. Then the bad guy, like it alternates, so you don't get that same pile up in the same way. So even when you start an encounter, like I was, I was playing a talent where there's an interesting kind of back and forth with your resource, because you can spend into debt, like getting a psychic nosebleed, like you put yourself into sort of energy debt. And that sort of thing is really fun. But like when you start a big like late stage combat encounter, you've got a bunch of victories. You can automatically do your ult. Like if you start a combat with 5 victories, you can do your 5 power victory, your 5 power resource thing, right? Like it's you kind of start with all that power, and that feels really cool. And it doesn't have to be building up that meter, but then it's going to be the bad guy's turn, and they're going to start with like 10 malice or something. You know what I mean? Like it's
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, I hope that answers the question, all right?
I'm really not sure it does.
Provide some advice on how to set up encounters in Draw Steel, particularly. Let us, just for the waning moments of this show, jump to a quick question, which comes from Matt, who was asking about improvising fun NPCs. How do you improv an NPC that players will love? How do you avoid making NPCs that come across as too simple or perhaps, in my words, forgettable? Shawn, I think you had some great advice at the top of this episode in terms of just simple things like using a hat or a prop or something like that.
The old Vine method. You put a pencil case on your head, you're the mum now.
Okay.
Okay.
I can't be the only one who remembers this.
Yes, you can.
No!
You're old, Dael. You're old. My rule is you can't have an NPC be too simple because you can always do one cool thing. And it depends on what kind of NPC you're talking about. Are you talking about somebody who they're going to interact with over and over and over again, who's going to be an important part of the plot? Then, okay, you want some depth to it. But if you're talking about the barkeep, the weaponsmith, and the alchemist, give everyone one cool thing and make it mean something in terms of the world, the plot, or the theme. So the weaponsmith, she represents the war that has happened, and she is suffering from something that happened during the war. That reinforces that theme. She's still selling you weapons. She's still making you your magic, whatever, fixing your armor, but that's her theme. The barkeep is about the greed that is inherent in this world and is always trying to get one more copper out of you in some way. It becomes the thing, right? Oh, the price just went up. You just got back from the Dragon's Hoard. The room that was 1 gold pieces is now 3 gold pieces. Oh, inflation. What can I do? Right. So one cool thing and reinforce the theme. It won't always capture the imagination of every player, but it will reinforce the things that are important, which are the themes, the plots in your world.
Worth noting that you don't have to make every NPC super cool. You know, in terms, like I, when running games, gauge my energy levels because it can be tiring kind of jumping between characters and putting on multiple different hats and who's this guy again and what accent did they have or whatever it happens to be. Just a second shout out to Oblivion on this episode. We've all done the thing where we run around the Imperial City. You go into the shops, you go, Stonewall shit. As you skip through all the dialogue options because you just want to sell a bunch of shields, right? So if it's like you don't have to create interesting NPCs for every single shop, or even if you do want to create interesting NPCs for some of the shops because they reinforce something about your world, you don't have to play them out every single time if the purpose of going is just to quickly offload some loot or something like that. So kind of picking your battles so that when an important NPC comes up, there's less NPCs for your players to remember, so this one sticks out more. And B, you have the energy to be able to embody that NPC without being tired from just role-playing, for 15 minutes at a time, 3 other shopkeepers, if that makes sense.
My old tip for choosing just a couple of NPCs who are going to be memorable is it's part of the ye olde sperm principle, which I talk about in terms of world building a play. Everyone reacts. Come on, it's an easy way to remember.
Just comes out of nowhere.
Social, political, economic, religious, and military. It was something we were taught to remember. The different points that you should talk about in an ancient history essay. If you're talking about a society, talk about the sort of social aspects, the political aspects, the economic, the religious, and the military aspects. And so I use that in world building. It's very useful. Thank you, Mr. Kinlock. But I think it's memorable because it is sperm. Anyway, the point is that you should cover those bases. And I think it's good for any given locale to just have, an NPC that represents each of those elements. And some of those elements are going to be more important than other ones. Maybe you have room for an extra one who represents just hey, this is a person who has a silly name and a silly voice, because that's how you get players to love someone instantly, is that you call them Jonathan and you attach a silly voice to it. But, I think that that's a really easy way to really limit yourself to only relevant people. If it's a really big settlement, maybe splash out, have 2 of each. But I think if you're having trouble sort of limiting it to a handful, that's a good place to start.
I really like that, Dael, especially because in D&D and most fantasy RPGs, which are descendants of pulp fantasy, most of your NPCs are going to be one-dimensional, and that's not a bad thing. They have a dimension which you want to express. They are a stock character, an archetype, and you might give them one little bauble to wear that makes them unique, that makes them different from your average innkeeper. Hey, this innkeeper is an elf, and that's unique enough. An elf in a human city, right? If you had an elf innkeeper in the town of Bree, that would be a very different scene. That would be a very different world building sort of situation. And then once the players are done with that NPC, they're never going to meet him again. They don't need to be anything more than a stock character. And we only need to get into the sperm principle when your NPCs are intended to convey some deeper information about the world, or intended to recur many different ways. It may be useful for you, the GM, to reinforce the tenets of your world at every position. But there will come a day when you need to pull an NPC out of your hat, and Boblin the Goblin comes to play, because that's all there could have been in that moment.
Embrace we've got an NPC in our current campaign called, I named them Tommen off the top of my head. And then one of the players suggested their surname is Jerry. And I was like, yeah, absolutely.
Tom and Jerry.
But we play them straight as a blade of grass. I don't know.
Straight as a blade of grass. I mean, I should also say, Shawn's thing is a non-sperm way of doing exactly what I was saying, where you just go, what are like the three big important things? Like what are the important sort of issues that are going on in my setting that I want to highlight? Let's come up with some characters who represent those. If you don't want to use sperm, that's also good.
Well, I think something that Shawn touched on there, which was important and maybe adjusts sperm a little bit, because sperm is for history essays, but for specifically fictional is spermt, which is the themes at the end. History doesn't necessarily deal in themes, but stories do.
Yeah. A lot of people try to add an extra M to sperm because they're like magic. But I'm like, no, magic should pervade everything. It should be in all of the... Spermtum.
Spermtum.
I've never been so glad I have a vasectomy.
And with that piece of knowledge, we are going to end this week's episode of the Eldritch Lorecast, the #1 tabletop RPG podcast in all the realms for a reason. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can give us likes and thumbs and stars and comments and other stuff by doing the stuff down below, as in the comment section, or, doing... Anyway, I'm getting out of here. My name's Ben Byrne here with Shawn Merwin, James Haig, Dael Kingsmill. We got through the outro, and we will catch you all next week for another episode.
This has been a good episode for the Court Club.
Yeah.
I love these email episodes when there's no news to talk about. We just get to be weird.
Satisfied Bubba noises.
We get to be weird is right.
Indeed.